This is the Wide Format Impressions broadcast.
Welcome back to the Wide Format broadcast. I'm Gabby Houck, and I'll be your host of today's episode. So for this episode, we are going to be talking about lean business practices because, let's face it, no print operation is 100% perfect. There's going to be bottlenecks, and there's going to be touch points here and there. So joining us today is lean expert Brian Van de Water of SPL Consulting, and he's here to give some of his wisdom on implementing lean business practices into a print operation. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Really great to be here.
And Brian, maybe just to do a little icebreaker, can you give a little background on yourself, what you do, what kind of makes you a lean expert?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Brian Van de Water, my company is SPL Consulting LLC. And I consult in three primary areas as high-level buckets: strategic and succession planning. Lean is a big portion of my business, and then talent development. I'm a certified behavioral scientist. I use DISC and driving forces as a methodology. And that really kind of comes back with that people side of anything with strategy and lean really are about managing change and people and how people are involved, playing to their strengths, that kind of thing. So at a high level, that's what I do in my business. From a lean perspective, was blessed to start out with a company. I worked for James River Corporation back in the mid 80s for my first job out of college. And Dr. Deming, one of the founders of Lean, was just making inroads back in the United States at that time. And they were early adopters of, at that time, it wasn't called Lean, it was statistical process control. And so I got trained very heavily in statistics and design experiments and failure mode and effects analysis, all the things that from a Six Sigma side of Lean is what it is today. I was trained with all of those tools in the mid to late 80s. I ended up training for James River, 2 facilities, about 700 people in those processes and concepts, developed engineering or process engineering methodologies around that, and solved some major problems with it. One was a turnaround in a plant in Ohio that my second plant I went to with them. It was announced that they were going to close it in a year if they didn't make money. I called the DM and said, "Hey, I'm willing to come to work for it." He goes, "We're closing, right?" And I said, "Well, but I was told if you could be in the black in a year, we can be in business." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "So maybe I can help." And so he said, "What do you want to do?" I kind of defined a job that was taking over quality, getting heavily into the technical, and then starting a process engineering group. And long story short, we solved a major problem that was costing us about $2.5 million in waste and returns a year. I solved that in about 6 months, and I got promoted and said, "Do it to the rest of the place." And we stayed open. And that was my first real application of trying to put all that stuff together. So from a lean perspective, that was the start of it. Through the rest of my career, when lean started to become the term in the early 90s, single minute exchange of die was the first. SMED is the first type of Kaizen that I was exposed to. I applied those tools throughout the rest of my career in improving businesses and processes. And trained in Japan twice, met Dr. Deming twice. So I've been around the block from a lean perspective. And I always am hesitant to use the word, or when people say expert, I am, but I still kind of feel like that's kind of like. I don't want to say presumptuous, but there's things that, every place is different. No solution's the same, but the tools I have that I use to drive what I do for my clients and helping change lives and improve businesses is using those tools.
Absolutely. And maybe for print service providers who aren't super privy to lean or Kaizen and think maybe it only applies to maybe like a manufacturing assembly line, how does it translate to a commercial or a wide format print shop?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Lean, often, I speak and I have a partnership with TLMI. And early on, the first 2-3 years I was with them, I'd get up on stage and they'd introduce you, "This Brian Van de Water," and it leads right into your question. Is when you think about what lean does, and from a Kaizen perspective, you're evaluating processes and the steps in which you go through a process, looking for in the lean toolbox, the 8 W's. So motion, touching things more than once, transportation, waiting for answers in the process or what you're doing. And when you think about that, most processes in any business, in whether it's again from a, we're kind of narrowing to the, label world and you're saying to wide format, but out beyond that, I've done work with large accounting firms. There are processes to process invoices, to onboard customers. In the last 3 years, 70% of the work I did from a Kaizen perspective was not manufacturing processes. They were front end. It was order processing, estimating, accounting, sales processes, marketing processes, quality processes. That same thing applies coming back to the wide format. I have worked with a number of clients in the wide web format, from offset, the big presses, down to some more the sheet fed smaller presses as well. So processes, and like in a changeover as an example, there are steps. They are different than Flexo or Rotogravure or digital, but the wide web offset world and wide web Flexo Roto as well, they still have things you've got to do to take the old job out, things you've got to do to put the new job in, ramp up, quality checks, all those kind of things are in there. So there are a lot of process steps. And that's what Lean does, is really helps give us a good way and a lens to look at those processes, to identify, where the opportunities for improvement are, and then create the framework for that new process.
What is your maybe advice, or what have you seen kind of other wide format print shops do to kind of reduce those touch points when it does come to finishing?
I'll use a client example in wide format. I was brought in not to do a Kaizen on the process initially, but I was brought in to look at how can I relay out their facility to not have to have offsite storage, which they did have at that time. And they were bringing on another large wide format press that they didn't know how they're going to fit it in the building. And so I started with that process, and then I looked at it, where do we store the in-process materials and sheets as they're curing. In their current process, they moved it, I think, 3 times to get it to finishing once it was off press. So we created a process that it got moved off the press, and it sat there until it went to finishing, to die cutting. So we didn't touch, we moved a couple touches. So that's one piece. And then on the other end of it, what was really interesting was something that came out of this process. They didn't have a clear picture of the capacity of the die cutting side of the business and the finishing side of processes. And as I got into it, I realized they were a machine and a half short. So I was able to highlight that for and show them that if you bring this on and it hits the specs it says that it can, along with what you're already doing, you need probably out of the gate, you need one for sure. And really, you're probably going to run some overtime too. And so that led to getting into that finishing process to, work on how do we make sure that, from a changeover perspective, setup production, et cetera, that, you have the tools where you need them. So you don't have to want to get them. We created a set of tools that were needed for each machine that were right where they needed them. And so we're able to reduce the setup times on those pieces of equipment that were already going to be over capacity to make that process more efficient.
With ongoing labor shortages, I'm just curious, how can print businesses use Lean to build a more flexible, cross-trained teams without overwhelming, the employees they have, if they are kind of short on employees already?
Achieve color consistency, efficiency, and precision with G7 Plus certification, the industry's gold standard for color management. Whether you're in packaging, commercial print, or digital production, G7 Plus ensures neutral gray balance and visual consistency across all applications, helping you reduce waste and improve quality. And getting certified has never been easier. Choose from live in-person training for hands-on experience, live online training for real-time learning from anywhere, or on-demand training for flexible, self-paced education. No matter your schedule, there's a G7 Plus certification option for you. Printing United Alliance members save 20% on all courses and certifications. Stay ahead of the curve, view training options, and get certified at printing.org/G7 Plus. G7 Plus is here, the next evolution in print calibration and color management. Built on the trusted G7 methodology, G7 Plus delivers even greater gray balance accuracy, improved tonality, and optimized color control across all printing technologies. This advanced standard helps reduce waste, improve consistency, and ensure seamless print reproduction. And getting certified has never been easier. Choose from live in-person training, live online training, or on-demand courses to fit your schedule. Printing United Alliance members save 20% on all courses and certifications. Stay ahead of the curve. Get G7 Plus certified at printing.org/G7 Plus.
Yeah. It's that it's in every industry, not just printing, where, all of my clients struggle with, COVID was kind of the pinnacle of the worst in the years following it, where you just couldn't get anybody to work and it was real hard. So we're finding people a little more readily now than before, but there still is a major labor shortage, and lean is a very powerful way to start to narrow the gap between having to find people and be able to run your processes. So one of the things that when I work with clients, we start talking about using lean to create capacity. Like in my business in the last 8 years, I've created over 185,000 hours of capacity for clients. And that's year one of the Kaizen. That's not subsequent compounded years. I thought of trying to do that and reaching out to all my clients to say, hey, are you sustaining it? What have we changed, and try to get the total hours? But it's probably over 1 million hours when we take that kind of approach to it. But what I say to them, when we start having those conversations, I make sure that their head's in the right place. Lean does not or should not become a tool to reduce labor, like reduce headcount. If you do that, I can tell you pretty emphatically, it won't take too long for people to figure out, work myself out of a job, and they stop working with you. So you've got to make people feel safe to create that capacity. And then it leads to, how do you cross-train that workforce? That is a conversation I have with virtually every client that I have, from starting with strategy, that when we start to do things that are going to create capacity and reduce some of the inefficiencies in the business, whether it's front end or back end, when we create that, I tell them, let's not use this to say, hey, we're going to either let somebody go or, eliminate overtime, which you're going to at some level. But the goal is to use that time to do exactly what you said, cross-train people to be able to work in multiple departments. I'll share an example. There was a client that I ended up, before I started this business, I put my toe into consulting once before. And I had 3 clients, and the third client taught me to go and work for him. It was a turnaround. It was a microbiology company, not in printing. And when I sat with the owner, I said that we're, if we're going to do this, when I create capacity, and we were working 400 hours of overtime a month. And I said to the owner that, I think we got 50% open capacity. And she actually lowered her glasses, looked over them and said, we're working 400 hours of overtime a month, right? And I said, I see the waste in our processes. And I said, so when we do that, I need your commitment. We're not letting anybody go. She said, okay. So fast forward, we went ahead. At that same time, the starting point, out of all of the workforce, only 2 people could work in more than one department. And so I said, we're going to cross-train the crap out of this place when we do that. And so as we did it, about 3 years into it, anyone who had been there more than a year could work in at least 2 departments, if not 3. And so when we had a gap in something to do, we just moved people into cross-training. And then that created that ultimate flexibility too, where oftentimes you got departments, even, and come back to the printing world, where one department's busier than another. And I've got a client right now that we are doing just that. We are cross-training 2 areas as we speak, so that if they're slow on this side, we just move that person across the aisle to the other department, and they can fill in and make things go forward. And that's where lean comes in. I'll share that example. We tripled the volume in that microbiology company with the same headcount. So we tripled the transactional volume we did, and we didn't have to add anybody. We created that much capacity, and through cross-training, the flexibility. So that comes back to the labor shortage. When you can do those kinds of changes, and that's a big one. Obviously, I was there 5 years, so it wasn't something we did with Kaizen. But as you create that capacity, use it to strengthen your team, not only from just cross-training, but if you think even higher level, and I'll put my behavioral sciences hat on, that in today's workforce, and especially with a lot of the, Gen Z and millennials, I just read an article from the people who manage and create the behavioral science software and assessments that I use, that it really comes back to, and it's really that human nature piece, that people want to feel valued. And a lot of the younger generation wants to know, what's my purpose? Where am I going? And what am I going to do to not just do the same thing all the time? And so I translate into, we use that capacity to create talent development plans. That we take our team, we find out what they want to do, play to their strengths. Hey, if they want to get involved in, if they're in production and they want to get involved with something with sales or doing a sales call or doing some outside service, then let's create a plan over the next year or two that we're going to expose them to that and then tap into them when they've got time to go do that work. And the power in that one is that helps you not only create the capacity and cross-train people, but when you're playing to what motivates them and what's going to keep them on your team, and that's the operative word there, is you want them to stay. And how do you do that? You got to feed the force. You got to feed the things that they need, and then you build your team.
No, I love that. Lean isn't just tools, it's culture. And what kind of practical steps can a print shop do to build a culture of continuous improvement on their production floor and keep their employees motivated?
Yeah, excellent question. That culture is the first part. I can share a couple just simple examples with clients. I've got clients that, many that are very well-run companies, large companies that you would know the names of, with, 20 plus facilities and so forth, and down to the small mom and pops. And you've got cultures that have, some really, really strong cultures, and you've got some that don't have the greatest cultures, that because of culture, morale is bad and turnover is high and those kind of things. I get involved in those scenarios, and starting there, I'll use an example of a company I just started working with this year. I say, let's revisit what your mission and your vision is for your business and make sure it still matches. And then we start getting into culture. If morale is bad, how are we going to impact that? And, some of the things come out like we need to develop the culture starting from leadership. And that's where I started with, as I work with companies, it starts with the leadership team, from the owner down to that senior leadership team, down to frontline supervisors, down to team leads. You've got to get those teams. And again, starting with the top, one of the things I say often that ends up being part of the vision is we will develop a culture to do what we say we're going to do. So that's a fundamental piece, is we just got to do what we say. And some of that is we got to not yell at our people. I've got clients that's what they do. They get mad and they yell, and that's not productive. So finding those things that you can do culturally to make the environment one that is going to make people happy to be part of is part of that. And then when you apply that to any tool, lean is a tool, strategic planning is a tool, behavioral science is a tool. Those are all things that take people to make it work and make it successful. And so you blend those two together with that thought process of making it an environment that people are involved. That's that talent development side. We're playing to their strengths and giving them purpose. And then getting them involved, that leads down to that base layer of your question of how do you use that to develop a lean culture. As I work with clients, typically they bring me in, I call them major kaizens. I come in for major process changes. They're a week event, and we transform significant processes. But as we do that, I use the words when I train people, I want to help companies develop and train an army of problem solvers. So we want to teach people most of my clients don't ever have someone that wants to run a major Kaizen. Even companies with black belts on staff, most black belts can't do and run effectively a major Kaizen. They're just not comfortable with it, but they can do the follow-up and the block and tackle and our auditing processes and find out what's not working and tweak it. But as you do that, you're teaching people how to look for things that aren't working. And then as you move forward, give them a framework to know when they can make changes and what level they can. I'll share this example. One of the companies I worked for, the goal was, I told my leadership team, we know we've made a change to our culture and it become a lean culture when a Kaizen happens with none of us leaders knowing about it or being part of it. And what we did is we put a framework. We said if it cost less than $500, didn't affect a department other than your own, and didn't create a safety issue or potentially cause a customer problem. It took 2 years of me every month in our communication meeting saying this, just do it. And finally it was on third shift. It was 2 wash-up guys and a core cutter operator that they did a Kaizen, and I call it mini Kaizen. It was 3 guys for about 2 to 3 hours. But they did a setup reduction Kaizen on the core cut. And they changed the process enough that it took from changing core sizes, I think it was roughly 6 minutes. they got it down to like 2.5 in that process. And so when that happened, what did I do with it as leader? We celebrated the crap on it. We shouted to the rooftops, look what they did. And as that went on, more and more people say, okay, they did it. We actually can do something in our process and make a change. It has to be documented. You can't just change it and not tell anybody. It's going to be documented. And that process then becomes the way we do the work. When you build that kind of framework behind it, now you get that army of problem solvers that are making little improvements every day that just drive your business forward.
Amazing. And I'm also curious too, say a print shop, maybe mom and pop, mid-tier, they're looking to get into lean. What advice do you have for them? And also what advice do you have for them, say if they do bring in a consultant, what's the biggest and most important thing they need to do once that consultant's gone to keep up what they've learned while a consultant was there with them?
Yeah. So how do they start? I have clients that, like I mentioned, black belts in their Lean Six Sigma training are mostly trained in Six Sigma, not so much in Lean, which is Kaizen. And so a lot of them aren't really versed in it first. And then second, most people who get a Lean Six Sigma certification, become black belts, are scientists and engineers. And I'm an engineer, so I say this affectionately, but most engineers don't have the interpersonal skills to deal with the complexities of personalities when you're in a Kaizen and it's emotional sometimes. We're taking something that you do and you've done for 10 years and telling you we're going to change all of it. And so it can get pretty emotional sometimes. And so they don't necessarily work super well. I've got clients that have black belts that have mastered that. But I think starting with someone that can learn that tool, if it's an internal person that can effectively not only use the tool, but lead the team. From a consulting perspective, one of the things that I've got feedback from my clients and just the results that I shared, that 185,000 hours capacity I've created, all but 11,000 hours of that documented have been sustained over a course of a year. The 11,000 hours was 3 different clients that didn't do. I've got 2 avenues I can go. About 75% of my clients use me for sustainment support. And that just means simply that after the event, typically I'll start out with the first month, we'll have 2 meetings. Second, so over a 90-day period, I'll meet with them probably 5 or 6 times and we'll review the reaction register. We'll go back and they've got to show me the audits they've done and on the process, is it being followed? And if not, why? And what are we doing about it? And by doing that, coming back to validating and auditing the processes to make sure that we're following the new standard work is the way we describe the process coming out of the Kaizen, that it's being followed. And inevitably, we'll find something a couple weeks in that we didn't see in the Kaizen. You've got to change that in the standard work, but then you've got to retrain everybody else using that standard work to do that. And by coming back and revisiting and validating those processes is how you get that change to stick. If you don't, those 3 clients I mentioned, one of them actually, paid me to do sustainment, but they kept saying they were never ready. They were never ready. And I finally forced my way in and said, we're going to have a meeting. And they just never would take those next steps. They kept doing what they were doing from leadership down. So that's kind of the recipe for success is you've got to have either someone outside that's going to take you to it and teach you to do that and hold you accountable to do it, or that I said roughly 75% use me for that 25%. There are companies out there that are really good at execution and they don't need me for that, but you've got to do that. The validation and updates to standard work, and then making sure that next step is that everybody then follows any changes you make is how you make it stick.
And I actually have one last question for you. Say a print provider, they're convinced their operation, is flawless, seamless. They don't see the need to look at their operations. What advice do you have for them?
And my advice for them is this, Gabby. I would say, speak for me, kind of sales commercial, I guess. Bring me in and have me do an evaluation of your process. And I've got some clients that were, in the label world. I've got a client, they had, 18 facilities, I think at the time. They were well-run, well-respected, but they really didn't use a lot of lean processes, and they were bringing someone in to help them. So I started with that. I have a client that I first met at a trade association where I spoke at, and I knew him for about a year. I'd seen him 2 or 3 times, and their VP of Ops said, "Oh, we don't need you for lean. We do lean." And so I just kept networking. I met the CEO. We got talking. One day he called me, and they were struggling with, they had a VP of sales that they had expanded the sales department. He had 3 managers now working for him, so doubled the sales force, and he was struggling managing managers or leading managers. And so they brought me in to coach him first. So I did coaching for him. That led to a sales and strategic plan initiative, because I found problems. They were 2 years into a 10-year plan to grow the business, and they hadn't grown it by $1, but they added 5 people, and 3 of them managers. And so we did that. And fast forward, that was very successful. We changed how they were going to market, what they were doing. The board bought on. And in 4 years from that point, they achieved their 10-year goal. So that's the long piece of it. But in the middle of that, as that success was starting to take shape, the CEO said, "Hey, Brian, we've never had an outside expert come in and take a look at our lean processes. Would you come in and spend a few days and tell us if you see some opportunities?" So I said, "Sure." And I did. But and again, to your point, a company says, "We got it. We're lean. We already have it." The first Kaizen I did with them, we created 5,200 hours of capacity. And they had 13 presses. We were working on a subset of that was 3 presses. We created over a full press of capacity in that single week.
Wow.
And in the wrap up, the CEO, he was in there. It was probably the biggest Kaizen I've had with a client. I think we had 14 people in the Kaizen, and 9 of them were the CEO, VP of sales, VP of manufacturing. So I had all the leaders in it, which was really cool because they got to see firsthand. And he told the whole team, he said, I have to apologize personally to Brian. And he said, because I remember we told him we didn't need him. And I'm sitting here looking at this with egg on my face saying, how did we not know that there was this much opportunity? So that's not uncommon for you to find opportunities like that, even in well-run companies. So I don't say it in a way to say you don't know you run your business well, but I bring a lens and a breadth of experience that helps me see things that maybe other people don't. And I get deep into the processes of people doing the work. And I ask questions like you're asking me, well, how do you do this? And people open up and start telling me things that open doors for me to go, what about this? And then I find opportunity. So I would say even a well-run company, if you think you got it, just take that little litmus test. Be okay maybe hearing that you're not as good as you hoped you were, not in a bad way, but meaning there's more opportunity for you with another look at how you get there. And the last thing I'll say to kind of wrap it up is one of the companies I ran, we cut setup time as one example from almost 3 hours to 38 minutes. And this is a company I was leading. So over a 5-year period. So that being said, is 2 years into it, I had companies come in. Green Bay Packaging was a supplier to us, and they saw what was happening in the plant I was running and changes we were making. And they said, Brian, would you ever come in and talk to our leadership team? Because we do lean too. We don't see any of this. And so I went in, I spent a day with the executive team and talked to them about what I do. But the point is that we didn't get to 38 minutes in one time. It was over 5 years. We probably did across all the press platforms, at least a dozen set of production Kaizens. We master the one we did, and then somebody else, hey, I think there's some more. Well, let's look again. We do another Kaizen, and we find more and more and more. So it's a journey. People say that, some people who don't really understand it think, oh, it's just a way to sell more. But it is. You'll always find something. Things change. People have ideas. I talk about that army of problem solvers. That includes their brains. We get them trained in the process. We want them thinking and saying, hey, what about this? If we did this, I think it could do X. That's how you make the magic happen, I guess, if I sum it up. Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Wide Format Impressions broadcast. You can find more great content at wideformatimpressions.com.